Assalamu alaikum. You're watching Views and News, and I'm Faisal Rehman live from our Islamabad studios. Today we'll be talking about the current ongoing US and Russian problem regarding the Ukrainian issue. Now, we all know the kind of sanctions that has been imposed on not only Russia, I would say, but also on Vladimir Putin and his allies. Even Belarus is included in that. Now, since this issue or this tussle is intensifying, what sort of an effect it is going to have on countries like Pakistan in particular, because we strictly believe that we will not become a part of any bloc, yet there is a very clear-cut indication that we are slightly moving away from the west towards the east. Now, as far as the European Union ambassadors in Pakistan are concerned, they in fact asked the government of Pakistan to support for the Ukrainian cause, but we remained neutral. We even abstained. That was the reason that perhaps the Western world is looking at Pakistan as if we are taking sides, but we are not. At the same time, having said that, because the Prime Minister of Pakistan, Mr. Imran Khan, was in Russia, and that was the day when Mr. Putin, the President of Russia, decided to attack Ukraine. So again, there were a lot of misconceptions that developed. Now, having said that, there is another very important part, that the West is on the one side, Russia on the other. About a dozen countries supported Russia. Countries like China, they abstained their option, whereas the Indians did the same. So was the case with Pakistan. Where will it lead? Question number one. How can we have an equilibrium between these two countries? How can we have that kind of a balance? Again, a very important factor. Number three, that the kind of sanctions that will be imposed or have been imposed on Russia, what sort of an effect it is going to have on a country like Pakistan, because we are looking at the north-south gas pipeline for our energy needs. We also want the Russian companies to come in and invest in the steel industry, in the agriculture industry. Recently, we got to know that we had signed a huge contract regarding the import of wheat, and we know that Russia and Ukraine put together, they produce about 30% of the global wheat production. So that is huge. You talk about precious metals, you talk about energy, you talk about so many other various commodities. Both these countries have a huge contribution. And as far as energy is concerned, we all know the kind of European dependence that is there on the Russians, whereas the Americans believe that they can look after their energy needs, but that is going to take at least a decade or maybe more, because the infrastructure doesn't exist. Where are we heading? Because looking at the current oil prices, that is really going to hurt the developing countries. You look at the gold prices, they were well over $2,000 an ounce. Around $130 a barrel is what the oil price is. Now, these are the real concerns. And we haven't yet recovered from the pandemic yet. Now was the time when things were getting better, but now this huge issue is, which is very, very unfortunate, because a lot of civilians are being killed on both the sides. A lot of Russian soldiers. Today, again, one of the general was killed. The total number of generals only that have been killed in this particular war, that is 2. One was killed about 2 weeks ago and another one now. So perhaps a lot is happening. But before I introduce you to our panelists, our production team has prepared a report. Let's watch that first.
The escalating Russia and Ukraine crisis is making the underlying Cold War between the United States and Russia very obvious, which is threatening the global traditional security. The United States President Joe Biden has imposed an immediate ban on Russian oil and other energy imports in retaliation for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Joe Biden said that the decision was taken in close consultation with the allies. He added that Russian oil will no longer be acceptable at United States ports, and the American people will deal another powerful blow to Putin's war machine. The United Kingdom, while joining hands with the United States in economically isolating Russia, has announced plans to phase out imports of Russian oil and oil products by the end of 2022. Meanwhile, Russia launched a list of unfriendly countries and their respective companies and citizens, and announced that all the corporate deals with these companies and individuals will now require approval by a government commission. On the other hand, the presidential decree allowed the Russian government, companies and citizens to temporarily pay foreign currency debts owed to overseas creditors from unfriendly countries in rubles. The growing strains between the United States, European powers, and Russia are making the whole world quite vulnerable towards another financial crisis, which will ultimately affect the developing countries the most.
Now, to talk about this, let me quickly introduce you to our panelists. We have with us in our studio on my right is Dr. Professor Riffat Hussain. He's a senior strategic analyst. Sir, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you so much.
And we also have with us Lieutenant General retired Talat Masood, senior analyst, an author, writer, columnist. Thank you very much, Al Saab, for your time as well. Riffat Saab, now in the fight of the two giants, where do we stand?
Well, so far we stand nowhere because we are treating this dispute, this war between Russia and Ukraine as essentially a European matter. But our stance of neutrality in this war will soon be exposed because, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, the repercussions of this crisis are global in nature. They will first of all they have affected the Europe's relationship with Russia, and there is a clear-cut division. Few of the former Warsaw Pact allies of Russia are siding with Russia, and Belarusia and Moscow seem to be quite in cahoots, and that's why they have brought into the ambit of the elections. But let me, while we are talking about the Russia-Ukraine war or conflict, whichever way you want to characterize it, President Biden has called it an unprovoked and act of aggression on the part of Russia, because once he invaded the Crimea and he absorbed that Crimea into his orbit. So the Western countries have been very upset about it, because they think that Ukraine should have the right to choose its independent way of life, and if they want to, it's a question of values, it's a question of their democratically elected government of President Zelensky, and they have the right to choose whichever way they want to do it. But the Russians have argued all along, particularly since 2014, that the matter of Ukrainian foreign and security policy is not only a matter of choice for the Ukrainian people, with whom President Putin has repeatedly stressed his close affinity, but has also pointed it out that Ukraine's foreign and security policy issue is integrally linked to the defense of Russia.
Correct.
So that's the reason, or that's the stated rationale which Putin has put forth. But we also have seen at least 3 rounds of failed negotiations between the Ukrainian government as well as the Russian officials, and those failed negotiations have caused tremendous pessimism inside the European capitals, and now these European capitals are probing China, whether China would be able to play any kind of a mediatory role between the Russian and the Ukrainian. So Chinese, like us, even though they are saying their stance is somewhat different from ours, because they say that unless and until the security concerns of all the countries, including Ukraine and Russia, are addressed in these talks, so these talks will not go where. But the latest attempt is to appeal to the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and he has promised to help the defuse the crisis. But on the other hand, we also see that the Russian offensive continues unabated. They have moved, I think, for the last 3 or 4 days. There are conflicting reports. There is a certain amount of lack of transparency as to what is actually going on in terms of the ground situation. But or to all intents and purposes, the Russians are expected to win or make the Ukrainian capital fall within the next 2 to 3 days. So that's what the situation is. So which means the situation is not of stalemate, the Russian forces continue to press for their offensive, and they have conquered a lot of territory in the east, and from the north closer to Odessa they are moving their forces. But I should say this, that I am surprised the tardy pace at which the Russian offensive has moved, and as you have pointed out that they have lost 2 generals, along with thousands have been killed, and there is a lack of transparency about actually what is the magnitude of the Russian forces and their losses that they have been suffered. We know for sure that there are about 2 million Ukrainians who have fled their cities, but the bombing and the airstrikes and the missile strike, they continue to hold the sway.
And interestingly, and as many as 200,000, I mean, they're still there on the border. Another 2 million are expected to leave in the coming days. So huge humanitarian crisis there in Europe. And interestingly, we just talked about the 2 generals, sir. There were reports, I mean, if you look at the Western media, they've said that hundreds of tanks have been destroyed and dozens of jets and helicopters, they have also been shot down. Obviously, these anti-tank and anti-aircraft guided missiles have been given to them. Those javelin missiles, which you can fire from the shore, you can keep them on your shoulder, just like stringers basically. And I think that is a mega disaster for the Russians. And now the guerrilla war has started. Cities have been choked. And let's see where it leads. But as far as the human casualties are concerned, sir, that's something very, very alarming. Look at the food prices, General Saab. They've been going up. You talk about corn, you talk about cooking oil, you talk about wheat, and so on and so forth. I mean, these will not only raise prices of wheat, perhaps corn is going to get a lot of price raised regarding the dairy products for that matter, whether you talk about milk or all the dairy products, cheese and butter and so on and so forth. So this is something which one has to look into and take into account, because now we can't expect the oil prices to be touching the highs the way they are. And according to General Saab, certain analysts, if the 100%, now they have said that 2/3 of the Russian oil supply is going to be cut, and within a year. But sir, this means that 2022, which we all thought will be a year of recovery after the pandemic, I mean, there is a huge issue in 2022, sir, and that could lead to a mega disaster as far as the economies like Pakistan are concerned. General Saab?
Well, certainly it would affect Pakistan's economy, not only Pakistan's, but the world's economy per se. And as you rightly mentioned, the greatest impact would of course be on fuel. As you know, Russia's the sanctions that the Americans have put on the Russians, these will have serious repercussions not only on Russia, but on countries like ours and many others. So I think the oil prices will go up, and already I think the oil prices have gone up to the level of 2014, and it would rise even more. And then it is not just when the oil prices go up and when a war starts, then there are so many commodities which are affected, and so there will be a global inflation. But the other countries may have the stamina to be able to sort of take the shock. But countries like Pakistan, which already have serious economic problems and were under, in a way, IMF and all that assistance, they would find it even more difficult. So I think there is also a need for a very serious realization within the Pakistan political system and political leaders to understand the gravity of the international situation and its repercussions on Pakistan, so that we are able to do our best and the people of Pakistan do not suffer, which is very much likely that their hardships will increase. And just saying that, because of this Ukraine conflict, we can do nothing about it and so on, will not really help in that sense. So there is a political dimension apart from the economic dimension and strategic implications of all this. Because from the strategic side, What sort of a position are you taking? Already the Americans are putting pressure on us and saying that, you are not talking about, you are taking sides in a way that you are not speaking forcefully or against the Russians. But Pakistan cannot afford to. And then look, India also and Sri Lanka all abstained from sort of voting because they do not want to be a party to this conflict, because we already have so many problems of our own, both external and internal. We don't want to get involved in this.
But still, if you look at China, the way they have supported Russians, obviously we do understand that the Sino-Russian friendship is really growing. Putin, especially during this visit, was just amazing, sir.
Well, I think this is an excellent question, because China also, I think, is recalibrating its position. This is my understanding. I may be wrong. You see, it doesn't want to get, it thinks it's a very major power. It's the second largest, most powerful country in the world, both in terms of economy, in terms of military, etc. Military not necessarily, but it's a very major country. It cannot afford to just go along with whatever the Russians in this conflict. It doesn't want to get involved. So what it is doing is, whereas it thinks that its coalition or its partnership with Russia is extremely important in certain areas, but it does not mean that for everything that Russia does, or every policy that it pursues,
they have to support Russia.
It has to support. So it's trying to play a much bigger role and a sort of a more strategic or more sober role in terms of trying to pacify, because it also harms the Chinese economy as much as anyone else's. And Chinese greatest strength is its economy. So what happens is that because of this, Chinese economy would be seriously impacted. And there will be very major problems, because China, I'm sure, is one of the largest exporters of Russia.
So the recent bilateral trade is around $220 billion. That almost doubled during post Crimea annexation 2014.
True.
So that gives you an idea that what sort of an engagement these two countries have.
Yeah.
But sir, again, do you think all these sanctions, for example, the Europeans will take time, sir, because Germany or Italy or even France, countries like Finland and Austria, they're 100% dependent. Look at the supply of coal, this oil, on top gas. I mean, these are the winters, sir. And you just can't afford to disconnect yourself from Russia and start depending on, for that matter, on Qatar or United States of America. Because recently there was this visit of the Qatari prince to United States of America, where he was assured that we will give you the status of a non-NATO ally. And let's see what sort of a support do we get from Qatar. But sir, do you think this could be an alternative for the Russian energy export to EU?
Well, it could make a difference, but I think given the extent of Europe's energy dependence on Russia, both in terms of oil and gas resources, that's much too large a gap to be filled in by the smaller countries. But the Qataris would love to replace some portion of Russia's supply line, but that's not good enough. Number one. Number two, when you impose sanctions, particularly in the energy sector, and there is already, and you are imposing sanctions on your energy partners, so then you run the risk of not only harming your own interests, because you are dependent on the imports of oil and gas from Russia, but when you try to hurt your partners by unilaterally imposing these sanctions, as is the case with the Biden government, America has plenty of shale resources, and America is not as critically dependent on the supply of oil and gas from Russia, as is case, for example, with Germany. 39% of German imports of oil and gas are dependent.
And Germany, after this Fukushima incident, have already shut down a few of their nuclear plants,
Yeah.
and in the future they will do more. So that is another
so
problem.
which means that the countries have to think of their own national interest, and would they be part and parcel of a overall Europe-wide or a nationwide ban? I very much doubt so. And one thing more important and more alarming about the conflict in Ukraine is because the Americans have lifted the supply of lethal and non-lethal weapons to the Ukrainian force, and and Germany has allowed the third-party transfers of its arms. They call it defensive arms, but in this conflict it's hard to tell which country is using offensive weapons or which countries is defending the defensive weapons.
They have also increased their defense budget, sir, by another
to the
100 billion.
100 billion euros. So these are alarming trends, and I think the biggest beneficiary of this conflict is the military-industrial complex
Of United States of America.
of the United States of
So now, since we were talking about that, what exactly is happening, because you switch on the Western media and you will get a different detail of the news. You watch RT, Jan Saab, it's a different version. And obviously media matters. This, I would say, soft power is the name of the game. Sir, Ali Mustafa Saab from Lviv, Ukraine, he's a correspondent of TRT World and has also recently interviewed our Prime Minister, Mr. Imran Khan. He's with us on the telephone line, so we'll get the latest update of what exactly is happening. Ali Mustafa, thank you very much for taking out your time, sir. Ali Mustafa Saab, can you hear me, sir? Hello? So we'll try to get connected to Ali Mustafa as soon as possible, because we really want to know what exactly is happening on the ground.
That would be very interesting.
Because when you see the Western media, as I mentioned, sir, they would always tell about the Russian casualties and the kind of damage that the forces are having, and nothing much. And obviously, they talk about the civilian deaths. Recently, there was this very interesting clip on social media, and I'll refer it to, sir, I'm not 100% believing that, but I'll refer it to an old movie of Dustin Hoffman and Robert De Niro. That movie was about the re-election of an American president for the second term. That was called Wag the Dog, in which certain images were created. So sometimes when you get to see that a reporter is reporting that there are dead bodies, and suddenly a dead body gets up and fixes and then goes back, that would always create a lot of ifs and buts in your mind. So Ali Mustafa Saab, Assalamu Alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam ji.
Ali, thank you so much for your time. Good to have you in a program. Now, Ali, mixed reports are coming in from Ukraine. You listen to the Western media, as I earlier was talking to my guest in Islamabad, you will get a different understanding of what is going on. But when you switch on RT, it's a different ball game altogether. Now, tell us what exactly is the ground reality. We would like to know that.
I've been here now this time around for 16 days. I arrived 2 days before the hostility started, and I was in Kiev. Then from there, me and my cameraman flew to Zaporizhia, which is on the eastern side, on the western end of eastern Ukraine, and that's where the nuclear power plant is. We stayed there for 4 days, and slowly the situation there started to deteriorate. The sound of bombings to our south, and slowly moving closer. We left Zaporizhia and drove to Vinnytsia, which usually takes about 8.5 hours, but it took us 13 hours to get through checkpoints. We stayed there for another 3 days, and then we moved to Kiev. And in Kiev, from the first time we arrived 15 days ago till the last time we were there about a week ago, it was completely transformed. The city had emptied out, at least the core of it, downtown Maidan, and there were sounds of sirens and bombings that were drawing closer by the hour. And the higher you got, you could hear the explosions much more clearer. And the Ukrainians were preparing for a complete siege-like situation. There were barricades all around. The Maidan had been completely transformed with the X-shaped iron metal barricades. There were concrete barricades. And about 24 hours or so in, we were taken to an unspecified location where we met, as part of a journalist group, the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who seemed in very high spirits. He seemed exhausted, but he was extremely charged up, and he was very defiant.
Now,
and he was
Ali Mustafa, we also learned that, according to Russian media, that Mr. Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, in fact, fled to Poland, and whatever videos which are being shown, they're actually coming in from Poland. Is it true, or is he still, since you mentioned that you met him in person, so that means that he's present there in Ukraine?
From what we met him about 5 days ago. From what our sources in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev, are telling us is that he is still there, and so is most of the Ukrainian leadership, including the parliamentarians. Having said that, the Russian siege, or what is becoming into a siege around Ukraine, or Ukrainian capital Kiev, is extending. We were able to go initially through a place called Zotomir, which was about 2 hours drive from Kiev, heading west towards Lviv. But now that road, that highway, has been completely cut off by the Russians from the northwest. And they're also moving in from the northeast towards Sumy. And the Russians are relentless. I know this is a war of narratives, and the Russians are trying to portray themselves as peacemakers or peacekeepers, trying to go out and, quote, denazify Ukraine. But their tactics on the ground are extremely brutal. They are merciless when it comes to attacking civilian areas, especially in places like Kharkov. In Mariupol, I've been trying to get hold of people that I was in touch with 5 days ago. There is no communication. That city by the sea Azov Sea is completely under siege. And they have linked up their forces from Donetsk to the east, and now Melitopol, which was just south of Zaporozhye, from the west, southwest. And they're sieging that town. They're also laying siege to parts of Sumy, even though they haven't completely encircled it, and also Kharkov. Having said this, Ukrainian resistance is also enhancing. Areas which were under control or which were set to be taken over, occupied by the Russians, are now seeing a reemergence of Ukrainian fighters. So they're not giving up. And this is, in fact, galvanized a sense of identity, because a lot of them have relatives, Ukrainians that is, have relatives in Russia, are married to Russians, and so on and so forth. But this time, even the pro-Russian elements that were in Ukraine are fighting against the Russians in some instances. So it's turning out to be a very dynamic situation. And by the
Ali
looks of
Mustafa,
it, it will not be easy.
another story that I read, that non-state actors, or you may call them whatever, but these Chechnyan fighters, are they also involved in this fight against the Russians? Is it true?
Yes. So basically, there are two kinds of Chechen fighters in Ukraine at the moment. There are Chechen fighters fighting on the side of Russia, led by Kadyrov, that's the Kadyrov brigade, and there are anti-Kadyrov Chechens that are fighting in and around Kiev. In fact, where we were in Kiev, at the Maidan, the Ukraine hotel, according to some, has been occupied by anti-Russian Chechens who are affiliated with various pan-Islamist groups as well. And these are some of the toughest fighters, because they fought the Russians in many theaters. Not only in Chechnya, Grozny, but also in Georgia. They fought the Russians in Syria, and so on and so forth. And the Ukrainians are actually giving these guys quite an elevation, because they have tactics and they have know-how of fighting against the Russians that the Ukrainians don't necessarily do. A lot of them do, but not as much as the Chechens. And it's not just the Chechens that are fighting on the side of the Ukrainians. Crimean Tatars, who fled Crimea after the Russian invasion of that peninsula in 2014, have also formed their brigades. Interestingly, these brigades are part of the Ukrainian Defense Forces and not the, quote, international legion that has been established in recent days by the Ukrainian president, which has people from Canada, people from the United Kingdom have come in the past few days. About 17 to 20,000 people have arrived as part of these international fighters to fight alongside the Ukrainians. And this
Ali,
number
another
is
important point. Now,
likely
this is
to
pretty
increase.
alarming, and yes, we do understand that what could happen. To me, it seems as if Ukraine could be the next Afghanistan. This guerrilla warfare tactics, because when you can't match your military with the military of your adversary or your enemy, this is the tactics normally which we see. Now, who is supporting them? Obviously, European Union countries as well as United States of America. What sort of weapons are being used, and are they using all these guerrilla tactics to counter the Russian forces?
These guerrilla tactics will come more into play when the Russians arrive, if they arrive in
city.
urban centers. But having said that, there's a huge difference between what was happening in Afghanistan, what is happening in Ukraine, just because of the geography. Ukraine lies at the Black Sea and between the Black Sea and Europe, and the major powers in the Black Sea are Turkey, Russia, and, well, to an extent it was Ukraine, but now that access has been cut off. Because Turkey is there, it will push.
But countries
and
like
you will see in
Georgia,
the next
Moldova, I
24
mean, they
hours.
also use, they can use this area as well. I mean, they do not have that direct connection with the sea, but still they have that influence. Even Romania.
Going back to what I was saying, in the next 24 hours, there's something called the Antalya Diplomatic Forum, during which the Turkish foreign minister will host the Russian and the Ukrainian foreign ministers in their first interaction since hostilities began, face to face. So Turkey will play a critical role. Will this role lead to some sort of impasse or some sort of ceasefire or some sort of agreement? We don't know yet, but it is definitely the start of a process. How much the situation spirals in this interim, we don't know. But yes, it could turn into full-blown guerrilla warfare, which then sucks in other countries like Poland, Lithuania, parts of Moldova, the Balkans, where there's something called the Republika Srpska, which is a Russian satellite. So Russia has been playing this game of creating these buffer satellite states, like the Abkhazia, Ossetia, Transnistria. If you ever heard of that, that's like a part of Moldova that is pro-Russian. So Russia wants to create these pockets of influence, but there are other players now that can play a big role in this as well, including Turkey.
I mean, if for example, if this stays on the way it is, as you're telling us, I mean, this could also be a problem for all these countries neighboring Ukraine and these non-state actors pro-Russia, all those rebels. I mean, they could create a lot of problems there as well. But last important question for you is that how many jets or helicopters have been destroyed as far as Russia is concerned? How many soldiers have died so far? Because we got to know that another general was killed recently today. And also tell us about this anti-tank guided missiles that were handed over to the Ukrainians from a lot of countries, Germany, Britain, United States of America. So is it true that thousands of tanks have been destroyed? What did you see actually on ground?
Well, we do know that at least 200 odd tanks have been destroyed, but
200.
it's very difficult. It's very difficult to determine, and not just with the javelins that were provided by the Americans or the NLAWs provided by the British. The Bayraktar drone TB2 has been quite instrumental in targeting Russian tanks and artillery and other hardware. But having said this, the Ukrainians claim that they've destroyed 500 Russian artillery pieces or tanks. The Russians say they've lost, let's say, 25 or 30 pieces, which is a ridiculous thing to claim. Where does the truth lie? How many, like for example, when we were in Vinnytsia, we know for a fact that a Belarusian fighter jet was destroyed, right? To put a figure on these things, or to put a number on these things is extremely difficult, because one side exaggerates the number of kills or the number of equipment it has destroyed. The other side, for example, the Russians, will try to negate their own numbers, but will exaggerate the number of equipment or personnel they've killed on the Ukrainian side. So, for example, the Ukrainians say that they've killed, or 8,000 Russians have been killed so far in these past 2 weeks. The Russians claim the number is around 300. The Americans say the number is anywhere between
498 was
2,000.
actually was the number which was like a few days ago. almost 500. So this must be over
So
600, 700 now,
all right.
for sure.
So the Americans are saying the number is between 2,000, 4,000. If you play the numbers game, you won't understand what is happening. We were talking about for the past few days a 65-kilometer column that is moving towards the capital from the north, Irpin, into Kiev, right? It's been 3 days that column hasn't moved a few kilometers. So there's a lot of misinformation.
That tells a lot, yes.
There's a lot of disinformation. There are some facts, but to determine what the facts are on the ground, unless you're embedded with the Russians or you're embedded with the Ukrainians at certain levels, you won't know exactly what is happening. You can tell, looking at where the attacks are taking place, or where there have been casualties, both civilians, for example, or if schools and hospitals have been bombed, or if a military target has been on the ground attacked. You can tell where the movement is through that, but to go into the numbers is extremely difficult.
All right, Ali Mustafa, thank you so much for updating us on the Ukrainian crisis. Thank you once again. Jalal Sahab, now this is what it is. It seems that, well, let's suppose not 500, but at least if 200 to 300 tanks are destroyed within a matter of almost 2 weeks, that is something to ponder upon. And the Polish government was also thinking of giving them the MiG-29s, which they already fly, and they'll be replaced by the F-16s. But since there is a halt as far as the F-16 production is concerned, but what I'm saying is that this is the support at the maximum level. It seems like that there wouldn't be any NATO boots in Ukraine. But Jalsa, one thing is for sure, if around 30,000 Chechenian or XYZ rebels get together to defend or to fight against the Russian military, sir, another Afghanistan is almost in making, isn't it?
Well, certainly. Well, as they said, that it is not exactly a replica of Afghanistan, but the fact remains that the Ukrainians are absolutely determined to preserve their freedom. That is for certain. And they have the full backing of the European countries and also the West, and especially the United States. The United
Nations.
And of course the United Nations. But the fact remains that for the United States, it's also an opportunity to bleed Russia. And it is also an opportunity for the West to bleed Russia. So I think they are also using Ukraine in that sense, that whereas they would be helping Ukraine in order to resist and to get back its freedom, but at the same time, this is also
they're also
motive.
leveling their score.
Yeah, this is a role, but it would also be at the expense of the people of Ukraine and also at the expense of the people of Russia. But that aside, that always happens. So I think it's going to be a long-drawn war. The Ukrainians are not going to give up. It's also a great opportunity, as I said, for the West and for US to continue to bleed Russia. Whether the Russian economy will be able to sustain it, because from what New York Times and Washington Post and other papers are saying that, and even the top economists of America, they are saying that the Russian economy is very hollow, and they think that it is what they had perceived of it. It's not that, and it's very likely that it might also suffer to such an extent that the people in Russia would also rise against, the government.
That's what Mr. Zelensky always says, that people of Russia wake up.
Yeah. So, but in any case, as far as the world is concerned, and especially countries like us, we will also suffer. Because as I said earlier, and
we are already suffering, sir. Food prices, inflation is already there in Pakistan.
So
oil prices, that is going to have a major. Though Imran Khan Saab did something, but that is a very temporary step that we have taken, sir. In the long run, let's suppose if this war continues,
and that step also has its consequences, because it is going to increase inflation, it is going to increase our debt burden. So it is not just simple to sort of find a compensation for what's happening globally.
Direct effect and indirect effect as well.
There are ramifications both at the strategic level, at the political level, and at the economic level. There is no dimension which is not there in this conflict. Although it is so thousands of miles away, yet it influences us so much. And I think that's why it's so important that some sort of a solution is found for this conflict, and it comes to the better. But I think, as I said earlier also, my great respected colleague also said the same. What I think is that it's not going to end that soon, because it's a great opportunity for the West.
And then they really want to keep Putin
Russia.
Engaged.
Yeah, bleed Russia. And they think this is great. And they know that at one time, of course, Russia, President Putin got very desperate, and there were chances of sort of a nuclear conflict or something, but that has receded. And I think wisdom has dawned on.
I think that is not a possibility either, Jalsa, because
no, but you know, at one time for a day or two, there was some sort of a worry.
And everybody was worried about it. When he called his chief of general staff and his defense minister and and told them to
and go for the higher alert of the
exactly. Now, sir, as far as the calculation of Vladimir Putin, because this man means business. He's very straightforward, and if you look at his body language, he knows what he's up to. So this man has been the head of KGB. He's been the prime minister. He's served in military. Now he's the president. He's a black belt, and you know the kind of character he is. But sir, even a man of this caliber can make mistakes, correct? There is another school of thought that most likely most of his close allies, a lot of people around him, they have not given him the right information, because money he has spent on strengthening his naval fleets. Perhaps they have bought huge yachts and all. I mean, there are stories, obviously, it could be true. A lot of Russians who are billionaires, they have their deposits abroad, they could create a problem. So, sir, I mean, you have to see on so many fronts when you're taking a decision to invade a country for your own personal interest or for whatever reason, even if those reasons are legitimate. Any miscalculation on his part?
Well, there was a huge miscalculation in terms of the timetable that Mr. Putin had put before himself in terms of Ukrainian resistance and how long would it take him to overcome that resistance. That definitely has not happened. We are into the 12th day of the war, and the Russian forces are still 15 or 20 kilometers away from Ukraine, and Ukraine as a capital of the Ukrainian country has not Kiev as a capital of the country has not fallen. So the very fact that it has not fallen has already discredited Putin's calculations of an easy victory over Ukraine. So that's one miscalculation that he has made. Now,
just like the Indian military commander who said that we will be having tea in the evening in Gymkhana.
Yeah, but you know, these are disastrous mistakes that all countries, particularly great powers, when they plan these things. But you know, he made the miscalculation, and he had grossly underestimated the resolve of the European countries and their willingness to extend support to Mr. Zelensky. But even if the reports are true that he has moved over to Poland, so Poland will be the next battleground.
Possibly
for Mr. Zelensky to operate from. And we already know that the NATO countries have lifted their ban on the provision of arms, both lethal, we're talking about MiG-29, and you know these
drones, Turkish drones, they play a very important role.
And Turkey has threatened that if Russia does not back off from this misadventure, they may like to close the access to the Black Sea. So these are the strategic considerations which Mr. Putin has to take into consideration to decide whether he wants to escalate further, which will be
I think these talks in Anatolia would be really important, where all the three leaders would be meeting, Turkish, Russian, as well as Ukrainian. So you're also, because since you're a retired 3-star general, sir, Jalsa, same question is for you also. Military miscalculation or strategic miscalculation?
Well, I think definitely there was an underestimation of the resolve of the Ukrainians, And also he didn't figure out, and I think he didn't take into account the fact that the Ukrainians are terrific as far as guerrilla warfare or resistance is concerned. They are also extremely sort of concerned that no way would they compromise their sovereignty. And I think these people are going to fight till the end. And that is where Putin, I think, miscalculated. And then the support that they are receiving from the West also, I think, there was a miscalculation on that part. I don't think President Putin realized that the West will think that it's a great opportunity, a huge opportunity.
It's a win-win situation for them.
To bleed Russia. And then at this point of time, already there was a very sharp division between Russia and the US and the Western world. And now this division will be further sharpened, and it's a great opportunity for US to bleed Russia through Ukraine. So I think we are going to see this for years to come, and the effect of that for generations, because the Ukrainians are not going to forget what the Russians have done to them.
Because when you listen to the Ukrainian people, they say, well, our brothers are killing us.
Yeah, so the enmity between Russia and Ukraine will last for generations, which is also a very bad thing that has happened.
I think that is a very important point. But anyway, sir, I think the shorter the war is, it's better for Mr. Vladimir Putin and for the entire globe also. And as far as his own concerns that if Ukraine becomes a NATO member, or perhaps if Ukraine becomes an EU member, that is going to raise a lot of eyebrows inside Russia also, sir.
One thing last I would like to say, people don't realize Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe. So it's
not a joke, sir. That's so true. Anyway,
million people.
sir, thank you very much, Professor. Jalsa was a pleasure having you. And that's all we have for this hour. Inshallah, I'll see you tomorrow at 8:05. Till then, you take good care. Khuda Hafiz.